Hello, I'm Allison Schrager, and I'm a senior fellow here at the Manhattan Institute. And today we're talking about probably what is becoming one of the biggest economic stories out there. I know for the first time in my lifetime, I'm starting to go into stores and see signs that prices are going to be going up 10%, 15%, because between labor costs and the costs of supplies, prices are going up. So people of my generation are now experiencing inflation like they've never known. And we've assembled an excellent panel. I can't imagine better people to discuss this. I'm about to introduce them, and you're going to forgive that I'm going to give very short bios, which really don't do any of them justice, just because I really want to get to the conversation as soon as possible. So to start, we have Mickey Levy, the chief economist for the Americas and Asia at Berenberg Capital, and also a member of our own Shadow Open Markets Committee. We have Mervyn King, the Alan Greenspan Professor of Economics at NYU and Professor of Law at NYU School of Law, and also the former governor of the Bank of England. And also his most recent book, Radical Uncertainty, is certainly written for these times. I highly recommend it. And finally, Joseph Gagnon, senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for Economics, and he also has a very long storied career at both the Fed and the Treasury. So everyone brings a lot to this party. So to kick things off, I just want to mention, I like, a lot of participation. So if you have questions, don't feel a need to wait to the end to invite them, just put them in Slido, and I will hopefully get to incorporate them into our conversation because I want you to participate too. So to kick things off, I want to poll the panel whether or not you think the current bout of inflation, last week I think it was 5.4%, which was much higher than expected, and it seems like that keeps happening. So at what point, but again, we keep hearing this is transitory. So when I see prices going up at the coffee shop, or that BlackRock is paying their people more, that this is just transitory and it's going to go back to normal. So I want to poll the panel. Is inflation transitory, or is it permanent, or is there really no difference? We'll start with Mickey.
Well, I think part of the price increases reflects supply constraints and will prove to be temporary, although that temporary may last a little longer than people expect. But at the same time, strong demand and all the monetary and fiscal stimulus point toward underlying and mounting inflation pressures that will persist. So I vote that it's going to persist, and it's a lot longer than people think inflation pressures are mounting.
All right, Mervyn, what do you think?
Well, I share that view of Mickey. I would just add one point, I think. I think the risk is highest in the United States, of higher inflation above target inflation in the medium term. I think the next country down that ranking is the UK, and probably the inflation risk is lowest in the euro area.
Why is that?
Because the sheer scale of fiscal stimulus, which is present in the US, is much greater than that, which is going to be applied in either the UK or in Europe as you get into 2022.
I see. And Joseph, what's your opinion?
So I agree with Mickey and Mervyn. I think you've got three of us who are on the high end of forecast for inflation going forward. So we agree on that. We might disagree on how good or bad it is. But I would just add one point. I think that we're probably going to have a very difficult time disentangling the signals in the next 6 months because some of these high prices are going to come down. You'll have negative inflation on those items, even as other items are sort of ramping up. And it's going to be very hard to figure out what's going on in the second half of this year. You might get very low inflation numbers because setting, I think, indicated monetary stimulus push the economy very hot next year, and that will lead to more inflation pressure next year.
I see. So you're saying like eventually used car prices are going to come down, and that might bring on overall inflation, while the inflation that's like maybe 2-3% right now is going to go up.
Lumber prices have come way down, and the high frequency data on used cars is already coming down. So that would be negative inflation going forward to offset what we've just seen.
So another question to you. we hear on TV all the time, and you've written about this at length, well, the bond market isn't worried. Bond yields are 1.3%. Should that be giving us any comfort?
Not much. It's true that the bond market is very worried, always has an eye on inflation, and investors worry about that. But the evidence from history, looking across multiple countries and many decades, is just that the bond market is a terrible predictor of inflation. It's just very low predictive power in the bond market. You just don't see swings in inflation that were predicted by the bond market before they happen. Bond market responds very quickly when inflation starts to rise, but not significantly before.
So before we started, Mickey, you were telling me how you were going back and looking about how people talked about inflation in the 60s. Do people always think that inflation is transitory before it's not?
Well, Allison, it's very interesting that, in the 1970s, from mid-1960s to 1980, the U.S. incurred higher and higher inflationary expectations. And it's quite striking when you go back and read what policymakers and leading academics said. And many of them said, like in 1971, it's just special factors. It's just temporary. And then there was, of course, the imposition of wage and price controls to address those, special factors. And what I find quite striking now is, policymakers and many people are using the same type of language, and particularly, the Federal Reserve, favors higher inflation because it sees the inflation through its perspective of what is best for macroeconomic stabilization policy, rather than thinking about the true impacts of inflation and what these higher inflation numbers mean. And so I'm concerned, and I think even-handedly the risks of inflation are higher.
So, Mervyn, I'm curious. Inflation might be elevated now a lot, and that might very well be transitory to a lot of these supply chain factors. But if we do have persistent inflation, what range do you think it's going to land? Are we talking like 1970s territory, or just say maybe 3, 4, 5%, something something we haven't experienced in years?
Well, it all depends. One thing leads to another. Even in the late 60s and 70s, you didn't jump straight from very low inflation to double-digit inflation. It gradually picked up. And I think the concern that I have is that central banks have become overconfident about their ability to control inflation precisely. It's as if, one particular intellectual model of what drives inflation has become adopted as something that is a sort of completely scientifically understood. And I was concerned when the Federal Reserve announced its new framework last year, this asymmetric average inflation target framework, in which the idea was to run inflation a bit above target for a certain length of time to compensate for an undershoot of inflation below target, because it implied that it was possible to control inflation that precisely. And as we've just seen, it isn't. When the Fed announced that framework a year ago, it didn't believe, it had no reason to expect that inflation now will be 5.4%. It was thinking instead of how it could just get it above 2%, maybe to 3% for a year to compensate for an undershoot. But that's the kind of calculation that maybe works in a model, but doesn't actually work in the world. And to go back to a point that Joe raised, I think this is a very important point about the next couple of years, in which the focus ought not to be on the growth of GDP or some sort of aggregate view, but there's going to be a significant reallocation of resources in which some sectors will be expanding, others contracting. That's going to be true of the prices of those commodities too. And of course, any inflation number can always be disaggregated into a series of individual price changes. And the difficulty is to abstract from that a degree of underlying inflationary pressure. And I think that earnings indicators will be very important, and broader measures of inflation expectations will be important too, to see whether concern about inflation gets embedded into wage bargaining, for example. But the biggest concern I have is not that we can't predict the future. I don't think any of us want to be nailed down to a particular numerical forecast. But the concern I have is that central banks are overly confident, not only about their ability to control inflation, but about their ability to forecast 2 or 3 years ahead what interest rates they are likely to set. And in this environment, I don't think the Fed could honestly know what interest rate or QE it wants to engage in 6 months from now, let alone in 2023, 2024. And what's important is not to get the debate focused on what the dot plot is going to show, 2 or 3 years from now, but what the Fed is concerned about today. And I think signs of a greater concern that there are risks to inflation, not a precise forecast that it will pick up according to some number, but a recognition that there are concerns about inflation risks would serve all the central banks very well, rather than this pretense that forward guidance is a weapon that we deploy now to try to engineer a recovery, when in fact we simply don't know enough about the economy to make that kind of commitment.
So my understanding of the intellectual underpinnings of all of this is that, and now granted, these models do not account for supply shocks at all. They assume that inflation is largely demand driven, is that this is all done through an expectations channel, and that you can anchor inflation by anchoring expectations. So therefore, the Fed can, through its press conferences, impact inflation now and impact inflation in the future by saying we're going to do something about this in the future, which always struck me as dynamically inconsistent. But that's my issue. Do you think the Fed is credible anymore? Well, actually, all of you. I would like to hear about from.
Yeah, I think it still has credibility, but I just want to underline everything Mervyn just said, and just add to. It was a brilliant statement. I just want to add 2 points. 6 months ago in December, the Fed forecast inflation this year would be 1.8%. In March, they increased it to 2.4. In June, they increased it to 3.4, and we know they're going to have to revise it up again in September. Secondly, about this issue of managing inflationary expectations, the Fed can manage expectations in financial markets. But can it influence price-setting behavior in the non-financial sector? And I think the answer is no, but the Fed presumes it can. And once again, I think there's this, one of my real concerns is the Fed is looking at inflation through its perception of what inflation may be appropriate for its long-run macro stabilization policy. That is, it's based on its fear of the zero lower bound and a collapse in inflationary expectations. That's like the Fed fighting the last battle. I think the Fed is missing the point on the impact of inflation. And just one final point on that. We all know that the higher inflation, regardless of whether it's temporary or permanent, is having its largest impact on low-income people. So the Fed has this dual mandate, maximize inclusive employment, yet its policies are actually harming the people precisely it's trying to help.
May I jump in?
Yeah, please.
I would take a little issue with what Mickey just said, because I think the point that you made, Mickey, is true, but I think the size of the employment effect on low incomes is much, much greater than a change of inflation from 1.5 to 2.5 or 3%. That's tiny compared to the gains that you're seeing in real wages at the low end of the labor distribution, it seems to me. But if I could add one point to Mervyn's point, I think it's absolutely right that inflation has been so stable for the past 20 years across the advanced economies that we've come into this thought that, a move from 2 to 2.5 would be significant, or a move even from 2 to 3 would be overwhelming. Well, look at history. That's not a big move. It is a big move in only the past 20 years. And Alison, you're right. In terms of many people alive today, that's all they've seen. But I think the rest of your panelists are quite a bit older. And we remember when inflation could go from, in the 50s, inflation went from -2 to 10 to 1 in 3 years in a row. In 1949, it was -2. In 1950, it was 10. And in 1951, it went back to 1. So, that is possible. And we have forgotten that is possible. And I think the Fed has maybe forgotten. But I'm a little less worried than Mickey and Mervyn about how the Fed will respond. I think it will quickly adapt and respond well. I have more faith in the Fed maybe than they do. But I totally get the idea that the Fed thinks it can fine tune when it cannot.
What do you think how do you think it will respond? Will it just respond by phasing out the extraordinary stuff, which is now, as Mervyn's op-ed points out today, actually now become not so extraordinary? Or is it actually going to increase rates or maybe even potentially take us into a recession? Do you think that it'll really do that?
I think it will respond faster than it thinks it will now. The dot plot will be proven wrong. I think the Fed, here's the thing, and I'd be curious to know what Mickey and Mervyn think. Larry Summers has been saying that the big risk here is that the Fed's going to have to throw us into recession to fight inflation because that's what it's done in the past. Well, my reading of history is that there are times when the Fed raised rates to fight inflation and didn't cause a recession. 1994 comes to mind, but there are others. And for example, 2005 is another one. Later on, there was a housing bubble problem, but initially it didn't cause a recession. If we don't get into financial fragility, it shouldn't cause a recession. The reason that happened in the 60s and 70s was that Fed was not responding quickly enough and strongly enough. It wasn't communicating what it wanted to do. It didn't have a target for inflation. It was sort of basically acting without any framework to guide it. And so it caused recessions that then weren't that helpful because people didn't know what their inflation objective was, and they didn't carry things through the way Paul Volcker finally did. I don't think we're going to get back to that. The Fed is very, very attuned to that risk, and I think that's one thing the Fed will not do, is it will not repeat the mistakes they made in the late 60s and early 70s. And it took several years, as Mervyn said, it took 5 to 7 years of horrible Fed policy for people to finally unanchor their inflation expectations and then lead into the horrible 70s. That's a multi-year process that the Fed is not going to allow, in my view.
So Mervyn, do you think that the Fed has control over people's expectations and has the mettle to, and can they? I mean, I don't know if anyone saw Nouriel Roubini's Project Syndicate essay where he said that, we're not in the 60s and 70s and that it wouldn't just cause a recession, it could cause a depression. His debt levels are so high if they actually did contractionary fiscal policy. He tends to be a little dramatic, but, it's a valid concern.
So I'm not going to make any forecasts. I think the interesting question about what Joe said is, will the pressures on the Fed that may come in the next few years mean that they won't be as determined to avoid inflation as they might otherwise have been? I think Joe is certainly right that in the past it took quite a long period before people realized that inflation was going to be a serious problem and action was required to deal with it. In part, I think that's because that required also an intellectual revolution of people abandoning the idea that simply boosting demand was the best way to get the economy to grow. A recognition that there was a supply side to the economy finally came in. I think Joe's right that that's still there in the minds of central banks around the world and in the Fed. But I think the thing that worries me to some extent is the increased pressures on central banks in the years ahead. It's going to be much harder to take tough measures to control inflation than it was, I think, in the 1990s and early 2000s. And I say that for two reasons. One is that the problems of financing government debt are much greater now than they were then. And I think that particularly when you start to withdraw QE, or if you raise interest rates, then the income which central banks then have to pay on the reserves with central banks will rise. That's going to affect the budget constraint, essentially, of the public sector. So I think that there'll be pressures on central banks to continue to making easy conditions for governments to finance large budget deficits. The reason I picked out the European Union at the beginning of one of my comments was because that's one area where I think there's greater institutional resistance to significant expansion of budget deficits. But the other reason I worry is that central bank mandates have expanded. And I think changing the mandate of a central bank to include other things, whether it's inequalities in income, whether it's climate change, starts to draw central banks into a political process. Once you start to have very nice jovial meetings with government officials about what we're all going to be doing to prevent climate change, it's actually much harder then suddenly to say, sorry, I can't discuss this issue about interest rates because we are independent in monetary policy and we will make our own judgments. I think it is rather important for a central bank that's going to be genuinely independent to have a narrow mandate that justifies independence. Once you start to get involved in all these other issues that are genuinely political issues, it's much harder for the central bank to argue that it should therefore be independent. And these pressures, I think, will add to an environment in which central banks may just simply be slow to worry about the risks that they're taking. And if you add all that to my concerns about the intellectual framework that somehow captured the world of monetary policy, in which there is, as Joe pointed out, this belief that you can fine-tune and control inflation, and that you can use forward guidance in a world in which you'd have thought the big lesson of the last 18 months was that stuff happens, unexpected things occur on a big scale. But no, we apparently can give forward guidance as to where interest rates are going to be 3 years from now. There's a sort of madness in that position, and that's the kind of thing which can eventually corrode the commitment to being ready to take action and being preemptive, where you're more worried about the risks than otherwise, even though you don't feel you're confident in making a precise forecast. Those are the factors that make me concerned that central banks may not eventually take the action that they need to. Now, whether they will need to take it, we don't know. That depends on how the economy develops. So I take Joe's point, but I'm slightly nervous as to whether not just the Fed, but all central banks don't quite have the right stuff that they might have had 10 years ago.
Hey, Allison, Joe made a very interesting point. You brought up Larry Summers, who said the Fed, is going to need to clamp on the brakes and raise the risk of a probability of recession. So the issue is, how strong is the economy and how much does inflation go up? So let's take kind of a baseline that some of this temporary factor wash out, but you see an underlying growth, increased mounting pressures on inflation. So inflation comes back down to 2 3/4, but then starts to look like it's not going to go away and edge up. It very well could be that the Fed says, okay, we don't want to do anything to jar the economy or financial markets, or as Mervyn just emphasized, we don't want to do anything to jar our role inside the Beltway. And so we may have a permanent new high. That is, even if inflationary expectations stay low. So we just don't know. And one of the problems is the Fed in its new strategic plan didn't give us any guidelines at all for what it would find acceptable on either inflation or any numeric framework for its employment objectives. But so when we think about going forward, the Fed has been so sanguine about inflation because 5 years of zero interest rates after the financial crisis and QE2 and QE3, inflation remains subdued. But if you go back to that period, it's really quite striking that the reason why inflation stayed subdued is all of the Fed's efforts to stimulate the economy didn't generate any sustained acceleration in aggregate demand. So its stimulus really didn't work. And I think it's coming to realize that conditions now are like completely the opposite of back then, and they're using the wrong framework to think about currently. So that's a way in which the Fed could fall behind the curve. So we just have to see. I mean, my perspective is if all this monetary and fiscal stimulus actually work the way they're supposed to, then you're going to have some sustained growth in aggregate demand, maybe even some lingering supply constraints, and you get stronger growth. And then the Fed's winging it. It still hasn't told us what they're going to do. Even though I said earlier, the Fed still has credibility, it leaves me very uneasy. And, one final point, and this follows up on this critical issue that Mervyn just brought up about fiscal policy and the like. What struck me in earlier, a couple months ago in the fiscal debate, Treasury Secretary Yellen came out and said when they rolled out the Biden's fiscal 2022 budget, she came out and said the Fed is keeping rates at zero and will continue to do so. So now's the time to go big. And if there was ever a statement that oozed fiscal dominance, that's it. And I think the Fed is in a bind, and it's in a bind. And I'm sure housing lobbyists are lobbying against the Fed taking away the purchases of MBS and so on and so forth. So it's involved itself in things, and it's conducting a policy now that it knows is inconsistent with its long run objectives. And I think it's just plain scared to change. And that's a problem.
So, Joe, just sort of picking up on that a bit, do you think QE works? And I don't just mean the MBS, I mean also buying more longer maturity government bonds. I mean, does this do anything?
Well, I've done research, and I've certainly done surveys of other research, and the overwhelming result is it does lower long-term rates. But I've also written a paper that shows that there's a zero lower bound for QE. In other words, you cannot push long-term bond yield lower than the central bank will push its short-term policy rate, and you probably can't even get all that close to it. So yeah, QE works, but when bond yields get below 1%, QE probably loses a lot of its impact. So I'm the biggest defender of QE out there, but I think, as Mervyn probably will attest, but I think there's limits to QE too. So I agree with that. But could I think Nikki raised a really interesting question, which I think your audience would like. And I'd like to get Mervyn's view on it too, if you don't mind. But that is how the Fed feels in terms of its political independence and its ability to do what it really wants, or does it feel constrained? Is there fiscal dominance because they can't raise rates to threaten Biden's fiscal policies? I could be wrong, and probably none of us is in the room where is discussed nowadays. I was in that room for many years, answering questions from the governors and chairman, but haven't been for a while now. But I know my sense is from reading and knowing Powell and Clarida and Williams. I've known them actually especially Clarida and Williams for a very long time. I just don't believe they are that politically pushed around. If anything, I think they feel now they have more insulation from the political process because Congress is so bitterly divided, and it's hard for anyone to really do an effective attack on the Fed. It's hard to see Congress writing a law that would actually seriously impinge on the Fed, given the 50-50 split in Congress and the fact that Biden, I don't think, and Yellen would certainly not encourage it. And Biden's advisors would not encourage it. I just don't see the Fed feeling that kind of political heat now. It could change. But right now, if anything, I would say the Fed probably feels in a good space politically. And I think they genuinely want to do what they're doing. Maybe misguided, and I think we all agree here on this panel that they're probably going to get a lot more inflation than they ever expected. But I guess where I might differ is I'm more optimistic that they will then respond appropriately. There's plenty of room for them to raise rates and to stop QE and even to sell assets. And, I think they can have a huge effect on the economy if they want to, if they need to. And they will. I don't think they can control inflation within tenths of a percent around 2%, but I think they can prevent inflation from rising permanently. I absolutely believe that.
So Mervyn, I would like to hear your thoughts more on independence based on what Mickey said too.
So I think there are two challenges that the Fed will face. I accept what Joe says about the individuals. I also have a high regard for them individually. I think they're probably too wedded to a particular model of monetary policy than I would wish them to be. I think there's a lot more uncertainty. I think the economics profession has tended to say, we got a model and there are shocks, which mean the world behaves in a different way than the model. And we know nothing about the shocks, but the model's right. And my view is the opposite is the case. Actually, we know less about the model than we might think. We do actually know a lot about the shocks. We know that last year the shock was a COVID-19 shock. We know a lot about what that means. And this is one of the reasons why I think mistakes have been made in monetary policy. But the difficulty, I think, the two challenges they face is first the one that Mickey described, which is I think it's true that a good deal of the current rise in inflation will prove to be temporary, and inflation may go up and then come down, but that may disguise an underlying degree of upward inflation pressure, which is ignored when inflation starts to come down, either at the end of this year or the first half of next year. And that's the time when it will then turn out to be too late to worry about having prevented an increase in underlying inflation to levels which are noticeably above target. And then hence I think the Larry Summers question, which is, if at that point central banks start to intervene and they've got to push down inflation expectations and take action to bring inflation back maybe sooner than they might otherwise have wanted to do, that's when you start to run the risk of creating a slowdown and perhaps a temporary recession in order to bring inflation back to the desired area. So that's one big challenge they face. I think the other one is that even if the individuals in the Fed or other central banks themselves are genuinely committed to hitting their inflation target, the environment in which they work and the pressures on them are not under their control. And I think that it's quite easy to imagine that either failure to reappoint or appointing other people or making it clear that there are directions of policy that it might be interesting to explore that would be welcomed by politicians, and people who are not willing to explore it would be regarded as people who are no longer helpful or even imaginative enough to pursue sensible economic policies. This is the kind of pressure that politicians love to bring. I can give examples from the UK where if you look at the memoirs of David Cameron and George Osborne, what they were desperately keen to do in 2012-13 was to find someone who genuinely believed that forward guidance would be another way of trying to stimulate the economy, because they were desperate to see it grow faster. I don't think there was much intellectual weight to that argument, but that didn't stop them deciding that the right thing to do was to look for people who would believe in that. And whether that was a good or a bad thing, you may disagree. But the fact that they did it, and the fact that central bankers noticed that they did it, is something that will be taken into account in people's behavior. So I think this is the worry, that because they underlie, in the 1990s and early 2000s, certainly in the UK with a newly independent central bank, all the political pressure was in our direction. It was behind us. We had a following wind from politicians who wanted the new framework to work. Now I think you've got politicians across the Atlantic, both sides, that want excuses for running much higher level of public spending without having to raise taxes to finance it all. This is something which, understandable that they want that, because there are so many good reasons for finding ways to expand public spending. And they also want the central bank to do what they can to make it easier to finance those high levels of spending. So I do think the general environment in which central bankers work is a much more difficult one now than it was when inflation was being brought under control in the 1990s.
So it seems like whenever we had, a monetary policy tool that was in fashion, and we stopped using it because it really failed spectacularly, and then it was abandoned. Do you think that's the future for forward guidance too?
Well, my own view is that forward guidance didn't really stand up to very much. After when it was first introduced, both the Fed and the Bank of England had to back down from it in terms of the quantitative targets that they had set for the reduction in the unemployment rate that would lead them to start to consider or think about changes in interest rates. And I think that the reason it won't work is that it presumes far greater knowledge of the economy than actually we have. And it doesn't make any sense to pretend that you understand something and can predict it when in fact you can't. In the end, you'll be found out. So I don't think it's a tool that's worth keeping. Simplicity is a much better framework, and I think the same critique applies to the average inflation targeting framework of the Fed, which, to use an old English phrase, is just too clever by half. It may work in a model where the model is assumed to be true, but if the model isn't a true description of the world, then it doesn't work. And I think simplicity, the great virtue of inflation targeting when it was first introduced, was that it was a simple, clear way to make evident what the objective of the central bank was, and to force the central bank to give a narrative that evolved over time that explained how the central bank saw the evolution of the economy, where it saw the risks, and why it was taking the measures that it was taking to try and keep inflation on track. I'm not sure you can really do a great deal more than that. And when we got near the zero lower bound, central banks came under great pressure to pretend that there were new monetary policy instruments that would enable them to remain the only game in town. Whereas in fact, it would have been better to have said, we've reached the limits of monetary policy. Other policies are now needed, whether they be fiscal or whether they be structural. That I think is it, because as Joe says, when QE was introduced, it was in a totally different environment. And it did work because it prevented a collapse in the growth rate of broad money, and it stimulated demand at a time when demand had fallen very sharply. But we're in a totally different situation now, and you can't keep persuading people to keep on borrowing and spending year after year after year. There comes a point when you exhaust the benefits of monetary policy measures because they are, by their very nature, a counter-cyclical or a temporary policy instrument. You can't just use them indefinitely. And Joe's research shows that very clearly.
Hey,
But-
Allison.
Mhm.
Allison, it's very interesting. Mervyn just mentioned the flexible average inflation targeting as overly complex. If we look at the Fed's new strategic framework, so it set out it embellished its employment mandate, calling it maximum inclusive employment without putting any numbers on it, but acknowledging that employment is determined by a lot of non-monetary factors, labor market factors and the like, that are beyond the scope of the Fed. And then on its inflation, it moved to this very complex strategy on inflation without giving us any guidelines for what it would accept, what it likes. And I agree, it's way too complex, and getting to a point that was made earlier, that monetary policy has been extended way beyond its scope, in part because the Fed's wanted it, in part because the Fed has been pushed in this direction. And it all adds up to it. We have to ask the question, is what the Fed doing now and the resulting, in part, higher inflation, is it helping economic performance? And I would say definitively no. I'd say the costs of inflation now are mounting. Joe mentioned the increases in wages of lower income people. Well, if you look at the most recent inflation data, they're higher than wages. So now you have declining real wages and declining. The higher inflation is going to start digging into disposable income. And so we have to really start thinking about these real effects. So once again, if we go back to some of the discussion, in the 1970s and other periods of inflation, it's really quite striking that a lot of the language back then was kind of start percolating to the top. Now, it's just temporary, or it's just due to special factors. And once again, one point that I was always taught, and the Fed emphasized, is monetary policy works with a lag, and it does work with a lag. And I think we don't know what's going to happen going forward, but I remember back to one of the points that former Fed chairs Volcker and Greenspan emphasized, and that is, the goal should be to lower inflation and inflationary expectations to the points where they don't impact economic decision-making by businesses or households. And I think now the higher inflation is beginning to create distortions and affect economic decision-making. And so I think it's a problem right now.
Joe, I think you were about to say something. Did you want to weigh in?
Well, I did. I mean, conversations moved a bit on, but let me say, yeah, I think Mickey's right that this 5.4% price increase is significant. It's probably the first significant burst of inflation we've seen in over 20 years in this country, and it reflects a big wrenching change in the economy. And I think coming out of COVID, many things will be different, and we have to work that out, and that's bound to be disruptive. So I'm not too concerned about that. It sort of is. There's no way around some disruption. But I'm very focused on what Mervyn said, and I think what Mickey also is thinking, that I think the real interesting point for me is going to be next March of 2022, when by that point, surely COVID is distant in the rearview mirror. Surely these temporary things have worked their way through. And the Fed is finally getting a clear signal that inflation is higher than their target, even after this is all washed to the economy. And I think that's where the rubber hits the road. And I think Mervyn is worried that at that point, if inflation is well above 2, they're going to have to raise rates, and could that cause a recession? And I guess my reading is, I don't think that at that point, inflation expectations will have been de-anchored in any significant way, that people would have really changed their fundamental behavior in a significant way. It's just the same old sort of overheating economy type thing that the Fed can counter by cooling off the economy. They may get it wrong. It's a risk, absolutely. And we may disagree, Mervyn, on how big that risk is. I absolutely agree with you. It's a risk they could overdo it. But I think there's a good chance they could manage it. I think I'm more optimistic than some about that. But let me throw a point in that I was going to raise, which we've been agreeing. I think we've been actually agreeing too much with each other. So let me throw a point in where I think you might disagree with me. I think the Fed should welcome higher inflation up to a point. It should raise its inflation target. We should have 3% inflation target, possibly a bit more, but 3 would be good, I think. And it would get us away from the zero bound, and it wouldn't be so bad that it would cause a problem for people. I mean, people forget Paul Volcker was lauded for conquering inflation. He, deservedly won plaudits from everybody for conquering inflation. And what did he bring inflation to? 4%. Inflation was 4% under Paul Volcker after he succeeded. He never brought it down below that. And yet we loved it and we were happy. And yet now, why would we think 4 is such a terrible thing? I mean, is it really when it was a huge success in 1985? I just, 3 or 4% inflation, get us away from the zero. I think the zero bound has just been far more damaging than we ever thought it would be 20 years ago. I see what they say to that.
It's not so much the level, but the change. Like, going from 2 to 3 or 2 to 4, does it undermine the credibility of the original target if you keep changing it?
Before, let me just say, the Fed would not and should not take this lightly, but central banks have done careful studies where they rolled out a new framework, and New Zealand raised its target from 1 to 2 in 2 steps, and it didn't de-anchor inflation expectations, and it was actually quite a success. And as long as you explain clearly why, we don't like inflation, but a little bit more is good for all these reasons, and it's something we will only consider once every 5 or 10 years. So, and we take it very seriously. But I'm happy to hear what Mickey and Mervyn say.
Mervyn, take a shot at it.
So I don't agree with Joe on this. And I think the reason is that if you just take the Paul Volcker example, I think all economies struggle to get inflation down from very high levels. And the interesting thing was that when we introduced an inflation target in the early 1990s, we had initially a range because nobody thought it was possible to get inflation down to 2%. Just thought there's no point setting a target that we'll never achieve. Because by that stage, the Bundesbank, the great German Bundesbank, had never achieved an inflation rate that low. So the question is, does it matter if we go back up from where we are? I think the starting point really matters. Paul Volcker did achieve a tremendous thing by bringing inflation down from well into double digits to 4%. And we brought it down from 27% to something much lower. But then we couldn't get it down to more sustainably low levels. And I think the worry I have is if you say, we've been close to 2, we've been below 2 for a long time, we're going to try and get inflation higher. The first mistake in all this was that actually no one did manage to get it higher. They were trying to get it up to their target and they couldn't. The idea that you just raise the target at that point isn't very compelling. But deep down, the argument that, well, inflation's gone up much higher than we thought it would. We didn't intend it to get this high. But hey, it's not such a bad thing after all. We'll just accept it. Does have a ring of complacency as opposed to a measured move on the basis of serious studies that you want to go to a higher level of inflation. And I am also less convinced that the zero lower bound was a major problem, partly because QE was an appropriate short-term instrument to use when interest rates got down close to 0. But also, and perhaps more importantly, because I don't think that monetary policy is the right policy to deal with most of the problems we've experienced in the last decade, which I think have been much more of a structural nature, a need to reallocate resources across economies and within economies. And these are changes in resource allocation for which monetary policy is not the appropriate instrument. So I don't believe that saying, if we could suddenly get inflation up to 4% a year and keep it there for a decade, that will solve our problems. I don't think it will. And my worry would be that people feel, well, they're just a bit cavalier about it. They've struggled to control inflation. They don't want to take the difficult measures that would control inflation. They're just telling us it's fine if it goes to 4. But maybe in a few years' time, they'll say, well, it doesn't matter, we're going to go from 4 to 6. Don't quibble. What's the difference between 4 and 6? No one can prove that 4 is better than 6. We'll go to 6. And then before you know where you are, you're on an inflationary spiral. So I don't see a lot of merit in moving away from the basic belief that price stability, allowing for some positive inflation rate to compensate for quality changes that are not in the official index, it seems to me a sensible position to be. I think Joe is absolutely right that you should never say target 2%, outcome 1.4%, result disaster. Equally, you shouldn't say target 2%, outcome 2.6%, a disaster. It isn't. But what you should worry about is whether people believe that the central bank has a clear, consistent framework in which it's operating. And I think once you start to fiddle with the inflation target, you run the risk of undermining that.
Let me add a few points to that. Joe, how could the Fed change its target to 4% and still say its objective is price stability? I think it would lose credibility. And we have to keep in mind that even if the Fed were successful at generating 4% inflation, that doesn't create more permanent jobs. It doesn't increase potential growth at all. And so I think it's doing so would backfire because it would be extending monetary policy beyond its natural scope, lose credibility, and using kind of an old-fashioned term, it would be read as trying to buy your way down the Phillips curve to create jobs. And it just wouldn't work because what Mervyn said, the misallocations and everything. And I rather than talk about raising inflation target, I think the Fed ought to, reassess, where it's comfortable with its proper scope of policy, and then once again step away from its model and it's bent toward counter-cyclical monetary policy and concerns about the zero lower bound, which I think is fighting the last battle, and think more about what they're going to do now with inflation above that, because they haven't given us any guidance at all.
So we only have a few minutes, like 7 minutes left. So I want to sneak in an audience question, bring them in. So we're having a conversation about inflation today. Sorry. Would we be having a conversation about inflation today, absent or fiscal stimulus, however warranted? And we're also adding on, we'll be having a conversation about inflation next year if we have even more, say, a $3.5 trillion stimulus. I guess the question is how much is this inflation being driven by fiscal policy?
I'll take a stab at that. The fiscal policies which have legislated, in response to the pandemic, about 27% of GDP in deficit spending, and the Biden administration is proposing significant more. In the short run, it's clearly adding to aggregate demand along with the Fed's monetary stimulus. So we don't know how to disaggregate that, but it seems to be, adding, and we can see that, you have seen a significant increase in the rate of saving and the stock of saving, and it's increasing purchasing power, and that should be spent, with some lag. So I would say to some extent, it's a fiscal problem. And once again, let me just conclude by saying, we're all focusing on inflation in central banks, I may be a constructive critic of the Fed, but our fiscal policy woes are magnitudes larger than our monetary policy concerns, or at least mine.
Mm-hmm. All right, so I guess to wrap things up, so with the 5 minutes we have left, Mervyn, you mentioned you think there's been central banking errors. I was curious, what would you do? You had an interesting op-ed today about QE, where you were critical of the way it's being used. Do you think it's time to start tapering? And if so, how would you do that?
Well, I don't want to second guess the immediate decisions of any central bank, I think. But I would say two things about what concern me. One is that during the past year and a bit with COVID-19, we've seen dramatic falls and then recoveries in GDP. But the most striking thing is that when people have tried to estimate what's happened to potential supply, it's basically followed the path of aggregate demand. That is, this has not been a business cycle recession of any kind at all. This has been governments and businesses and households themselves reducing both demand and supply. That has therefore not opened up a large output gap for which it was sensible to try and fill with either monetary or fiscal policy. I do think that fiscal support for the economy was crucial last year and for much of this year. So whether it was paying out high unemployment benefits or whether it, as in the European cases, furlough schemes, things that increased budget deficits were crucial to avoid businesses disappearing when we want them, most of them at least, to come back into existence when the restrictions come to an end. So I think that was a very sensible thing to do, that fiscal support. But the two things for which no one has really produced a convincing argument are one, substantial expansion of quantitative easing to, quote, support the economy when the economy fell sharply because of supply constraints and governments imposing those reductions. And secondly, adding to fiscal stimulus once the restrictions have come to an end. So we're coming out of this now. It doesn't make sense to have massive fiscal stimulus looking ahead unless you can demonstrate that there's a very large output gap. And what I was struck by, I went to a seminar of US economists, and no one, Larry Summers and I were the only people saying, look, this stimulus is going to push up demand to a point where it does create inflationary risks. You can debate how big, but certainly it's in that direction. And nobody argued against that analysis. The argument was almost a political one, which is it is so important that the public expenditure that Biden wants to make is implemented, whether it's infrastructure, whether it's payments to help those who've lost out from the growth of the last decade. Those political benefits are so important that they were prepared to countenance inflationary risks rather than create political problems for President Biden as he implements what is a rather imaginative program of expenditures. Well, the obvious retort to that is, great idea if you want these expenditures, but why don't you pay for them by making people pay taxes to finance them? There isn't a free good here, and there's no large output gap to fill. And then I worry, in addition, about the fact that central banks, Mickey mentioned the Greenspan definition of price stability when it doesn't really affect, inflation doesn't affect people's plans. I think Alan Blinder's got an even better one, which is it's when price stability is when people stop talking about inflation. I worry when central banks stop talking about inflation. And when central banks give more speeches about climate change than they do about inflation risks, that's a time when we should worry. Now, Joe is going to comfort me by saying that actually the Fed is going to stop talking about climate change so much and start talking about inflation risks. That will be a sign of success.
All right. So, Joe, if you have like 30 seconds, if you just want to have the last word.
Okay, sure. I think an interesting question is going to be what happens fiscally and whether this fiscal policy will get us out of the low interest rate equilibrium we've been in. But I tend to agree with Larry Summers. For demographic and technological reasons, we've been in a long period of very low interest rates, very low real interest rates, coupled with low inflation has meant we've been at the zero bound. I think most advanced economies have been below potential for almost 30 years now because of these factors. And I think we need, if the fiscal isn't going to do it, we need something to get us out of this bad equilibrium. And that's why I want a little bit more inflation.
All right. Well, thank you so much. This has been fascinating. I've learned a lot. And I hope you'll tune in to more of our programming, and we're hopefully going to have some more this fall as well. Is that a bell ending me?
It's a House of Lords division bell. I'm summoned to vote.
Good timing.
That's hardcore. And I don't think we can end it any better than that. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. And as I said, please check out our website and think about supporting our work here at the Manhattan Institute. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, Mickey. Bye, Joe. Bye, Alan.
Bye.
Thank you very much.